How has the pandemic affected restaurants? Hello, this is Jonathan Mays, editor-in-chief of Restaurant Business. And in this week's episode of A Deeper Dive, we are talking about the pandemic and its impact on the restaurant industry. Now, you probably remember the pandemic. It wiped out a massive percentage of sales 5 years ago this month, and more than half of restaurant workers lost their jobs. That period was an earthquake for the industry, and it has since been followed by a bunch of aftershocks like supply shortages, runaway inflation, labor shortages, and now traffic declines as consumers get frustrated over price hikes. We wanted to know what kind of changes this has had on the restaurant business in the years since then. And so I've asked Lisa Miller, a consumer strategist and author of The Business of Joy, to join us on the podcast to talk about these things. Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. Glad to be here.
All right. So as we look at the industry now, after 5 years, by the way, I can't believe it's been 5 years, but then again, time has no meaning for me anymore. But how do you think the restaurant industry is different today than it was 5 years ago?
Well, just to set the stage, I know this is March. We are right in the thick of this overlap. It was Friday the 13th when the lockdown happened. And we have to just kind of pause for a moment to say when the pandemic happened, it was like this shock to our system and our communities, and restaurants play such an important role. And it was like the music died and our communities were like soulless. And so fast forward, the impact, I know people don't want to talk about it or maybe don't want to hear it, but honestly, Jonathan, we're still unwinding the unintended consequences from the pandemic, and our communities are back to some degree, but still not to the same place that they were pre-pandemic.
I don't think there's any question about that. If you go to certain parts of any city, I live in suburban Minneapolis, for instance, and if you go to downtowns on certain times of the day, now Minneapolis has a really great night restaurant scene, but there are parts of town, especially if you go during lunch hour, for instance, you're not going to see the people that you used to and stuff like that. So for sure, we haven't seen, it's still clearly different in many different respects, especially in certain communities.
Well, I have a question because, I do ask questions, Jonathan, for a living. So I'm going to ask you and then I'm going to ask the listeners. So if you had to pick a number in your head to say what % of consumers, and this was data from 2 weeks ago, so, February of 2025, what % of Americans, 1,000 consumers, said that they're back fully to all their activities? What number would you guess? What percent?
That's a really good question. I'm going to say 40%.
Wow, you did pretty good. So the number is actually 50%, 55% of Americans. So the insight there is, I always say, we got to look at the data, but kind of see what others see, but think what others don't. So that means there's actually massive pent-up demand still remaining. And we heard that word. Do you remember, all these words, stay home for 2 weeks, flatten the curve, pent-up demand. Well, the good news from an optimism standpoint, there's still massive pent-up demand because consumer frequency isn't back to where it was. We're all sitting at home in our pajamas watching Netflix.
Yeah. There's definitely pent-up demand. Restaurants today can get consumers to go to their restaurants for one reason or another. I've been bringing up Chili's almost every single podcast for somewhere in the neighborhood of the last 6 months. So I'm going to bring up a different example. I'm going to go back to October of last year, for instance. And you had Wendy's, McDonald's, and Burger King all running really fantastic promotions. Wendy's was running a SpongeBob SquarePants, and they were serving a Krabby Patty. It wasn't actually a Krabby Patty because it wasn't made of crab or whatever. But their sales went up 10% that month. And, so there is a faction of consumers that will go out for one reason or another. If you just give them a reason to, they will go out, and it's kind of up to the restaurants to keep them, but yeah, they can definitely be incentivized to go out.
And I think honestly, Jonathan, what you just said is so important. And what I see in the data is you know the line, and we've talked about this before, is I always say discounting leads to disloyalty, not loyalty. And so the difference between like a Chili's or even a Wendy's, that's had some good results, or a brand like Texas Roadhouse or Fogo or Cava, some of these things, they're offering value, but it's not really discounting. And when you can actually, so in that example that you were just talking about with Wendy's, to grow their business, what the insight is it's great. Let's get them through the door. But are they having a great experience to want them to come back? Or are people just switching from brand to brand, looking for the next best deal? And that's where the insight, I think we have to, whether you're QSR, FSR, it's that customer experience. And I always tell people, people are investing in their tech stacks, right? Everybody's talking about AI, their tech stacks, what's the next, any conference you go to, there's so many, sessions on that. But then I'm like, where is the next best dollar spent? Honestly, training. I have it, I always say it's time to shine if you're in the HR training. And we've got to train our employees even more so, because once we drive them in through marketing efforts and advertising and promotions, if the operators aren't ready, then it's empty trial or empty sales because they're not coming back.
Yeah. Right now, the best restaurants are absolutely investing in their operations. Look, you can have a really good, well-run restaurant and not get sales for one reason or another, but on balance, consumers, when they go out, they want to make sure that they're having a good time, and they're going to punish you if they're not. So you might be able to get them in the door. You can get people in the door. Like Wendy's got people in the door with that, with the Krabby Patty collab. Keeping them is another thing altogether. And what's going to keep them is giving them a really good experience, making sure everything is, the food is fresh, making sure that, it's well presented. The restaurant is clean, preferably updated. The service was quick. You can get people in the door. Keeping them is another thing altogether.
Yeah. And I was just thinking when you were talking, if the data, because for those that maybe haven't been following along, I collect 1,000 consumer surveys every month. And I started literally March 20th, 2020 with this project called The Journey Back to Joy. And what I was just thinking about is there are these cycles where 2020, when the doors opened, people were still pretty fearful, and it took longer for the restaurant recovery to come back because we became scared of each other. And then once people started to come back, there was this grace period where we're all in this together, the kumbaya moment where, oh, it's okay. We're just happy you're still here. And, they had grace when there was slow services. And you remember when back, Jonathan, where, it'd be that we had the 25% capacity, right, for restaurants. And you would go in and you'd have to wait an hour, even though there was like a gazillion tables open. But people were just so excited that the restaurants were open, and there was this grace and humility and humbleness. And then 2021, 2022, consumers freaking lost their minds, because that's where people were like throwing soup at employees, and people were scuffling over rules, and we just kind of lost our humanity in 2022, 21, 22. Then 23, 24 has all been about inflation. So then the experience isn't worth it. So when consumers go back to restaurants, whether it's through the drive-through or carryout or at full service, it's just not the same vibe or the feeling and the connectivity that we had 5 years ago. And I hadn't really thought about it in retrospect until you were just talking. And operators that can really deliver that connection, and I know that's an overused word today, but it's got to come from compassion and care. And yes, you have to be convenient, but you've got to earn your way to that compassion and care. And that's really what's missing in many restaurants today.
All right, let's head in that direction, because I think if you look at the restaurant business today, it is different. It is first off, it is bigger than it's ever been. We spend more money on restaurants than we've ever have as a percentage of our income, which probably is one reason why they're frustrated over prices, because they see how much they're paying and how much they're visiting. But on balance, we're paying more. The restaurant industry is more efficient as an industry than it was 5 years ago. But, there is a clear tension and a clear frustration, and the industry is different. People are more, this was what Technomic was telling me. People are more likely to dine alone, for one thing, which is fascinating in and of itself. But look at the numbers of, off-premise occasions. In January of this year of this year's 73%. In 2019, it was 65%. That's an 8 percentage point jump. The restaurant industry right now, and it's not just, by the way, it's not just limited service. People aren't just flocking to McDonald's and Taco Bell. Actually, that's not true. Only 40% of restaurant sales are at limited service restaurants. So it's not, and it's no different than it was before the pandemic. So more restaurants are doing off-premise sales, and that is a and so what the concept of the restaurant is actually very different. And I know this is something that you care about because they're not the community centers that they used to be. And this was a pre-pandemic thing. I mean, we've been seeing this ages ago. But the concept of a restaurant is, restaurants went way too far towards get them in and get them out. And now, sort of we've lost that sort of connection. The restaurant is very different today.
Well, and I do think that should be a wake-up call, honestly, because in the data that I have, I always say this is a scary kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Two things. One is the dining rooms are shrinking. And for all the finance people out there, I know what you're saying. It's like, well, people aren't coming. And I would invite people to think about it differently, to say, why aren't they coming? It's not because they don't want to come to a place to connect. And in fact, the data shows that people are craving so much connectivity. And, particularly Gen Z is off the charts. And so what was the number one Gen Z? Fogo de show, restaurant. And so when you think about craving connections, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice to say, well, the restaurants, we don't need a bigger restaurants because we can't get people in. So therefore, let's make a smaller restaurant. Well, then you make a smaller restaurant and then the experience goes, it continues to shrink and you've just worked your way out of, dine-in experience. So we're not answering the right problem. The right answer is, why aren't people coming? And it's because we don't have an experience they want. So that's number one. Number two, we have a generation of kids that are vetoing going out to eat, particularly to dine in restaurants. And if we have a generation of children, 10 years and older, 10 years and younger, that basically just don't want to sit in a restaurant, then when they are teenagers, when they're young adults, they won't even understand the connection point of what a restaurant has. So I think we have to really look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, particularly in the full service world, what are we doing? And is this really, we don't have to continue on this trajectory. It's up to us to change the trajectory. On the fast food side, we are commoditizing brands, because if it's all about, the delivery and the off premise as it has. What is it going to be that a product doesn't become commoditized? So those are some big, big questions for 2025 that just got massively accelerated during the pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've probably heard of Starbucks.
Just a bit. My daughter is a barista there now, Jonathan.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. She probably, yeah. All right.
She loves it, actually. She told me for the first time in her life, she actually looks forward going to work. So She's writing the names on the cups now.
Really? So she likes the changes Mr. Nickel has brought.
She literally says the first time I've ever felt motivated to go to work.
Huh, really, that's fascinating. That's interesting. That is very interesting because, what they've done is to me, I think Starbucks 2024, I've come to the conclusion that year is a sort of, in many respects, a canary in the coal mine for what the industry has become and sort of this consumer rejection, because the thing is, like, again, the Chili's example, and by the way, BJ's and Red Robin are also enjoying some strong sales now because they're doing a lot of the same things that Chili's is doing. Consumers will go out to full service chain restaurants if they think they're getting if they're getting something for their money. And they will go out. And a lot of the people driving Chili's success right now are those Gen Zers, the people that think that the restaurant chain is cool now.
Right.
But Starbucks was the most forward-thinking restaurant chain in the United States. I don't think there's any question about that. And, here they were, everything they did, they were doing everything, really, really, really well. They had, they were making a lot of money with these customized drinks. They were just pumping out innovative product after innovative product after innovative product after innovative product. They had their mobile ordering was stronger than anybody else. They were getting 60+% sales from their loyalty program.
I was going to say their app drove visits for sure.
Their app drove a ton of visits, and then their sales just plunged. And, it might have been social media, but a lot of it was based on this conflict between what they were, what Starbucks was. Starbucks was a coffee shop, and you went and got your coffee, your espresso, your latte, or whatever. And you went on your way, or you hung out there all day. It was a coffee shop, and, they played like really cool music and whatnot. And then it became something completely different after the pandemic. And I think that the industry, that the consumer said, wait a minute, we still need, to your point, we still need this connection. And that's why, some of those first moves that Brian Niccol made were basically just to get that back, to get something.
Yeah, one of the things, so a couple of things I couldn't agree more, Jonathan, is that Starbucks is a great example of a brand that stood for community and connection. That is what the brand was built on. And to relax from this crazy world that we're in and come and get a little cup of coffee, maybe a bite to eat, and just relax and connect. Back in the day, it'd be like, go have your breakfast meetings there. And you could just stay and linger and chat with friends or coworkers. And I remember I have a Starbucks that's really close by to me, and it's one of the busiest in the country because, I always talk to the people there. And it's one of the busiest in the country because it's right by a church. It's right by a big school, busy neighborhood. And they remodeled it. And it literally took out all of the comfortable seating. Maybe they left one little corner. And it was like this low bar, like community seating, like one gigantic booth, the entire length of the restaurant. And the worst of it was the tables faced the baristas. And then they had one other bank back that was facing the other direction. So if you're standing waiting, and I talked to the servers, they're like, oh my God, we feel like we're in a fishbowl because everybody's sitting there just staring at us. And I thought to myself, wow, this is not good. And then it had the whole counter was about mobile app orders, and it had the alphabet of where you were with these little rows. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is commoditizing what was a brilliant branded experience. It's now transacting on coffee. And I'm excited. I know it's a tough road for Brian Niccol to turn this around. But my data always shows is like, we've got to remind people why they fell in love with your brand in the first place. And that's why a lot of legacy brands that are now being like a Chili's or a Starbucks, the thing that's in common, and I don't remember if we talked about it, I might have talked with Sam, but it's fascinating to me that a lot of these turnarounds are being led by CEOs that came up through marketing. And the folks that came up through marketing are really thinking and understanding the difference. And this is so important for everybody listening. There's a difference between growing your business, which is all about my sales today, and growing the brand. And what's happened in the last 5 years coming out of the pandemic, everybody is going to growing their business because it's been tough at the expense of growing a brand. So I think it's kind of this wake up call for operators is, especially if you're a mature legacy brand, find the spark and the joy, not only for your consumers and your guests, but your employees. Why is this industry the best place in the world to work? Because we've become so transactional.
Yeah. I definitely have a comment to the marketing thing, but first I have to say that if all of those communal tables burned to the ground and never appeared in a restaurant again, I would be very, very, very happy. I hate those communal tables with an absolute passion. It's just sort of like suddenly you have to sit next to, like, it's just, no, come on now. I got out of school a long time ago. I don't need to sit in a lunchroom again.
Well, there's some
Anyway,
brands I'm
no,
okay with. Starbucks, I was not so happy, but
no,
Velvet Taco, for whatever reason, I think Velvet Taco, I like their community, those
yeah.
high bars. But anyway,
You can
sorry.
sit at them, and I will go and eat in my car. By the way, it's where a lot of people are eating their car, which is just ridiculous. I also don't understand that either. But anyway, but the marketing thing is actually a fascinating point. I tend to think this is a little controversial. Nothing against chief financial officers at all. But if a restaurant company is led by a chief financial officer, I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical. And the reason is because I tend to believe that one of the problems the industry has is just a focus on, the focus is so intently on the bottom line. And again, profits are important. They're very, very good. Profits are not bad by any stretch of the imagination. But that focus so much on the bottom line ends up to cause some short-term thinking.
Well, that's the business versus the brand, for sure.
Yeah. Whereas in the restaurant industry today is very, very competitive, and it needs, especially in these turnarounds, you are just going to have to tolerate lower profits for a period because you have to make investments in certain areas. You're going to have to spend money on certain things and do certain things to change things. And I mean, one of the things that he did was stop charging for creamers, for add-ins, which was just, it was a simple little thing. It's costing them, you add it up, it actually costing them quite a bit of money. But it's a little thing that helps the customer, and they really appreciated it. Just being able to put my own creamer in my coffee is a simple thing.
Well, and
I know exactly how much damn creamer I want.
Yeah, well, but the crazy thing about that is, and again, a lot of people in the industry, whether it's the operators or the finance, it's like these changes that were made because of the pandemic. So that creamer example was because of the pandemic and not touching everything. But instead of bringing it back when the pandemic was over, they're like, the consumers, they're used to it now. Let's just leave it. We're going to take that away from them. Nobody's going to notice. Well, guess what? Those little death by 1,000 cuts. And one of the other things on pricing, clearly when I talk to consumers every month, pricing, it's that value equation is still kind of underwater. And the reason I'll just use that Starbucks example is, if you think of your basic, what you get for what you pay, on the denominator, it's a math equation. On the denominator, you have what you pay, but now it's also my time, because my time is valuable. And on the top, it's, the product, the service, the ambiance, all those things. But if you take a price increase, let's say 2%, 3%, 4%, heaven forbid, higher than that, and you don't do something to enhance your experience on the numerator, it's a mathematical, predictable, perfectly predictable that your value equation is going to go upside down. And people are like, yeah, that, it's going to happen. But then over time, people don't keep track of the full on differences of the prices since 2019. Consumers, we're all consumers. We all feel it. All the people listening, when we go out to eat, it's not worth it. And so I invite all of my clients and, the listeners, it's what really makes your brand worth it. And if you don't ask that question in your customer tracking study, do it today. 5-point scale, definitely worth it, not at all worth it, because satisfaction, net promoter scores, value for the money, that's not enough anymore. You have to be a 5 on a 5-point scale of definitely worth it, or they're not going to come back very frequently. It's that easy. And then you can mathematically decide what are the things you need to invest in: training, product quality, those things, speed of service. But at the end of the day, you can't just change the value equation and expect people to come the same frequency.
Well, let's go back to the example of your daughter, because you mentioned training. And I think that how the workforce views their job is really important. Restaurants is a service business. It's still a service business. And that means that your people actually have to be happy. And it hasn't necessarily been something the industry has invested as much into over some of them certainly do. And I think the industry gets it a little bit more today than it did 5 years ago. They understand that. That's definitely a change. It's different, but really good operators understand that your employees really have to be excited to go to work. And that's the point. Like, your daughter enjoys going to work, and she didn't a few months ago. And that's significant. And it just shows you that people still want to be able to have a connection with the customer as well. They don't want it to be what it had become.
Well, and I will tell you, first of all, she has to be at work. Like, she has an early shift at one of the busiest hospitals in Utah. It's a hospital, it's a franchise, but they'll do 1,200 cups, 1,500 cups of coffee in a shift because it's that busy, because people are ordering 8 at a time. But that campaign that they just put out, like the welcome home, and it's got the AC/DC Thunderstruck. It's a really good commercial. And anyway, I showed it to my daughter, and she's like, oh my God, that's me. Because number one, it's 6 a.m. She has to get to work and it's dark. And then she's having to carry all these milk jugs. And she's like, yeah, I had to do that today. And she's writing on the cups. And I go, what is it about it that you really enjoy? And she said 2 things. One is they took the time to train her. She trained for 2 weeks before they put her on by herself. And she she just thinks the world of her training manager, but it was a one-on-one training that she shadowed somebody. So they took the time to train her. But the other thing is that she really does enjoy that reciprocity. She told me a story where there was a regular. It was her birthday, and, she made it a point to do the birthday on there. And then the whole crew was like, happy birthday, Sydney. And so that reciprocity of how she feels when she shares, that connection with the consumer, she gets it back in return. I guess the last thing I say too about that, she literally could rattle off Brian Nichols. I wish I could tell him personally, but she literally goes, yeah, we got this training meeting and they rolled out all these things and this is what we're doing. And importantly, why we're doing them. So she feels communicated, taken care of, trained, and she loves interaction. So she's pretty, I'm like, she's been there she's still pretty new, I guess maybe 3 or 4 months now, but she's still loving it.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. So Lisa, I hear you got a webinar coming up.
I do, Jonathan. Thank you. So because March, it's when I started this journey back to joy research. Every March, I try to say, what do I want to do to kind of give back and help the industry? So I'm doing these 2 webinars. One's on March 26th, and the other is on April 2nd. The first is all about macro trends. So for all the data, I've been 80,000 consumers I've been tracking over 5 years. It's what are we going to do? What's the next 5 years going to look like? And then a deep dive on restaurants on April 2nd. So it's a free webinar, lunch and learn that anybody can sign up for.
Where you can sign up for it?
Yeah, so we'll put the link. You can go to my website, LWM-Associates, and you'll see the lunch and learn tab, and you can just sign up and it's free.
Superb. Lisa, thank you so much for joining me this week on the podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's always so fun, and it always goes by so fast.
And that should do it for this week's episode of A Deeper Dive, which was edited, as always, by Spoons, artwork by Nico Hines. You may find this and other episodes of the podcast on our website at www.restaurantbusinessonline.com/article/deeper-dive, and you may subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'm Jonathan Mays, host, podcast producer, and the editor-in-chief of Restaurant Business. Thank you for listening.